This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. An episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken kicks off today's show. The pair discuss invasive plant species and how people can control them. K-State Extension Beef Veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff progresses today's show with the findings of a recent K-State Research study on castrating cattle when entering the feedlot. He provides information on the different castration methods that were evaluated and the study's results. Mike Brouk, K-State Dairy Specialist, ends the show with more information on HPAI in dairy animals, including ongoing research being done at Kansas State University. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we're going to chat today about some invasive species, Drew, and you're going to kind of lead us on the way of the discussion. So what are we covering today?
Well, this sort of fits with the time of the year that we're dealing with right now. It's early summer, and folks who are managing native grasslands or managing really any ecosystem for terrestrial wildlife for sure ought to be paying attention to what's growing out there and being on the lookout for invasive species and thinking about managing those things. So I figured that'd be a good topic for today. So, probably the first piece that's important for us to think about is what is an invasive species. And there's lots of different ways of thinking about this, but the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health has a pretty good definition. They say it's any species, including its seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material that's capable of propagating that species, that is not native to an ecosystem, and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. For a working definition, it's important to know that these are plants or animals that can cause problems for us, that cost money to control, that can harm wildlife habitat in addition to people.
Why do we care about them? Are they impacting the wildlife at all?
That's really the reason that we're talking about this here. From a wildlife standpoint, sometimes we have Phragmites is a good example. There are native species of Phragmites in North America, but where we live in the Great Plains and up in the Great Lakes region, there are some introduced species of Phragmites, which is basically river cane, that is highly competitive, especially in places where it can get its feet wet. And it produces some good cover, and critters like pheasants or deer might want to hide in that cover. But the loss of habitat from the native plants that Phragmites is out competing vastly outweighs any cover benefits that those critters get from it. And so really what we're thinking about the most is that the competitive advantages that these invasive species have make them able to just take over. And you end up with a monoculture. Monocultures are really never good for wildlife because you only have one thing growing in one spot, one kind of food, one kind of cover. It might be too thick. It might be too sparse. Seeds might be too big. Those sorts of things are really the big challenges that wildlife have from these invasive species.
What are some of the things that we can do to help control them?
The really important piece of this is getting on them quick and trying to kill them when they're young is the most important piece because, if it's a perennial plant, as that root system becomes more established, then it might take several different chemical treatments to get that plant killed. Or as it gets older during a growing season, let's say we're talking about Sericea, if you can get on that and spray it in June or even early July before it gets real big and starts getting woody, then you might be able to kill it with a more readily available and cheaper herbicide like Remedy, whereas if you wait until August when it's easy to see and when it might be flowering, then you're going to have to use a more expensive herbicide that's going to have more residual effects, that's more aggressive. So controlling it quick is important. The other thing about young plants is if you allow them to go to seed, then whether it's an annual plant or a perennial plant, if we kill it this year, then there's going to be seed stock next year in that seed bank that can sprout back. One of the other interesting things about, taking care of stuff early is we do have some of these plants that produce chemicals that kill the other plants around them. That's called allelopathy or allelopathic chemicals. And so Old World blue stems are a good example of species that do that and get on it when they're young, but also that's an example of how some of these plants can really be adapted to outcompete the other stuff that's around them too.
What are some other types of control that there might be?
Yeah, so biological control is one that can be effective, but is also kind of scary to think about too, because you're typically introducing something that's not native to try and control something else that's not native that's there. So if you're not really careful about testing this in a controlled environment, you could be introducing another invasive species, and so that's a challenge. But really the best example that I know of for at least somewhat successful biological control of a noxious weed is there's this weevil that can be introduced that feeds on musk thistle. And so they colonize the area, they end up feeding on and damaging those musk thistle plants, and over time, they can reduce the infestation that you have. It's not going to be complete control. It might take 2 or 3 years before you can even see that they've made a difference, but they can reduce the burden that you have out there from those musk thistles.
Can you poll these plants or what can you do there?
Yeah. So there's several different ways to do what we would call mechanical controls. If you've got a relatively low infestation of something like musk thistle that's pretty obvious and easy to see, you can sure go out there and pull it. Even if you're going to use a chemical control program, if it's flowered, then you may want to go out there and clip the flowers off and spray it after you've clipped those flowers, because oftentimes it still goes ahead and goes to seed even after we do spray it, and so that can be a challenge. Cutting trees or other woody plants, that's something that we talked about last time. Sometimes, especially if you've got an annual weed, let's say in like a food plot setting, if that annual weed gets taller than your crop relatively quickly, then it can be the case where we can go out and have that mower relatively high so that we're mowing the tops off of that annual weed to keep it from going to seed, and that can allow that crop to grow up and take over and canopy and outcompete that annual weed.
What about grazing? We've talked about grazing in the past. Would that be mechanical control from an animal, or how would you classify that?
Yeah. So grazing is something that I would tend to call a cultural practice. We're sort of using, well, I guess an example of a cultural practice, if we're thinking about wildlife damage, would be like, night penning or something. We're taking those critters and we're just doing something a little bit extra to bring them in. Well, thinking about grazing or targeted grazing as being a cultural practice where we're using livestock to control a weed, right? But it's also probably a form of biological control. It's just not a wild species that we're putting out there to do the control. And, some examples of that, there's a lot of folks who have goats that have those goats for rent. And you can pay these folks to bring their goats out, and those goats will eat things that cattle tend not to eat that cause problems. And then another cultural practice, of course, that we've talked about a whole bunch would be prescribed fire. So those are a couple of different things that we can do that aren't really mechanical, could be considered biological control because they're part of the ecosystem, or a critter's doing it for us, but it's something that we're directing rather than just kind of setting into motion.
What about herbicides or chemical control? So, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or neither of the bunch. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think herbicides are a really, really important tool that we need to have. And there are a lot of noxious weeds or invasive weeds that you really can't control if herbicides aren't part of your program. So, I think getting out there quick and working on a problem before it gets out of control helps you minimize the amount of herbicide that you have to use. And there's a lot of benefits to that. When we're thinking about chemical control, there are some important things that we need to know. One of those things is that most of the most effective herbicides or any pesticide, really, maybe it's a rodenticide or something like that if we're thinking about prairie dog control. Most of the really effective stuff is going to be restricted use. It's really effective at killing things, and so you need some extra training to understand how to safely apply those things. And so if you want access to those as a private individual, then you could get a private pesticide applicator's license. And that's going to give you some extra training so that you understand your liability risks that are associated with applying these things, how to do it safely for yourself, how to do it safely for other people that may be around and animals and those sorts of things. Timing of application of herbicides is really important. There's some herbicides that work really good when the plants are young. There's some that work really well when the plants get older. And then there's also restrictions on when we can use different things in different times of the year. I think one of the other really important things that we have to remember is whether we're talking about chemicals or fire or really any management practice, it's almost never one and done. So, if you think about the time it's going to take for that stuff to re-sprout and you deplete the seed bank by continually going back and killing those plants, that's going to take quite a bit of time. And so, this is something that if we're managing for wildlife or if we're an ag producer or whatever, you just got to be vigilant. You got to be paying attention. Always be looking for those plants that cause you problems or critters that cause you problems. Feral swine, if you're in an area with lots of feral swine, be looking for them. Get out there and get them trapped quick. The same thing applies here. We need to get those invasive plants killed before they become too much of a problem and are allowed to reproduce to the point where we may never get them under control.
Well, thanks for that discussion today, Drew. I think it was a really good topic and really good information. Appreciate you listening, and join us next time on Fins, Fur, and Feathers.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts. You can listen to this full podcast episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by finding the podcast on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We continue our show by discussing a recent study on castration and how it affects feedlot performance with K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. A.J., thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be on.
A.J., what question or challenge were researchers trying to address with this study?
Castration is one of those management tools that almost every cattle operator utilizes. And because we've been doing this for so long for both, and we use castration techniques, Beef Quality Assurance recommends as early in life as possible. And, throughout different meetings throughout the state, I always bring that up. But I've also been challenged by producers and say, okay, Doc, I do all of that correctly with my animals, but when I purchase animals, sometimes there are these heavier weight animals that come in. How should we handle them? And everybody has their own 2 cents. Everybody has their own ideas. So it becomes an interesting conversation because we don't have the best data. So it becomes on what everybody thinks versus what we can prove. And so really this whole trial, this idea, it got brought up that what is, quote unquote, the best castration technique. And we don't know. Me personally, my assumptions going into this trial was as long as you're confident and comfortable with the technique, I'm with you. And it also gets pretty technical because as long as you can count to 2, you should be able to accomplish these tasks.
AJ, can you give some background information concerning this study's methodology?
Yeah, so the background on this is we wanted to compare the different castration methods. So we have bloodless castration techniques that usually goes to either crushing or being able to slow blood flow and eliminate blood flow to that that lower extremity, or we're doing a surgical technique. And there's several, different iterations of both. What we chose for this trial to compare and contrast is high tensile, elastic bands. Okay, so it was the calicrate bander. So we use the bander. There's a newer technique that has been discussed a lot throughout the industry as well in literature, where they use that band but also open the lower scrotum to be able to allow no buildup of pressure or anything like that to basically have that process happen much quicker. So we just did a regular band. We band and open the lower scrotum. We went old school on the kind of the Burdizo crushing tool. And so those of you that aren't familiar with the Burdizo, used to be much more common years ago, not near as kind of mainstream or utilized just due to technique, and it's a little bit more cumbersome with a large tool that can unfortunately be dangerous for some of our operators. But what it does is it crushes the spermatic cord, the cord coming down to the testicle, where it's a bloodless technique where it can crush, but it can cause, have a permanent castration after. So those were our three kind of bloodless castration techniques. And then we did a true surgical. So we did the surgical technique with what's referred to as the Henderson tool. That's attached to a cordless drill, and under low RPM, we can actually spin that cord to help with hemostasis or blood control, so they don't bleed. And especially with heavier weight bulls on arrival, if they happen to show up at the feedlot, which is not ideal, but if it happens, we want to make sure that we have adequate blood control. And to compare all these, what do we compare to? So we did decide that we wanted to compare all these techniques to an intact bull. So essentially, what's the big deal? What's the true hindrance on performance and growth intake, just from that technique?
What did the group of cattle used in this research look like, and where did they come from?
Yeah, so we this couldn't be perfect, environmental. We couldn't just grab, because usually we don't have that many bulls on arrival at our feedlots. And we also have the big confounder of health. Right? Many times when we get intact bulls at the feedlot, we can almost assume right away we have 150% higher morbidity and mortality in those groups of cattle just due to the risk of having to go through that painful procedure, that castration on arrival. So that's what we try to avoid. So we don't have that many. It's difficult to find. So we kind of had to make our own cutter bulls. So we bought some lightweight, high-risk animals out of the Southeast. We brought them in as intact bulls, and we just left them as intact bulls, but we got all their health issues, under control. So we kept those bulls for a number of months, got them all straightened out, and we took them from about 450 pounds up to about 750 pounds. That would be more applicable, more appropriate for that incoming arrival animal at the yard.
AJ, why is this research important to cattle producers?
This study, I think, we're trying to answer real questions coming from the industry. And no matter, whether it's a conversation just sitting across the table from each other on what's the best way. Well, I do it this way. You do it that way. We're both successful and we can still make that happen. But as an industry, do we need some consensus to try to figure out, is there a better way to do it going forward? And I think that's where the importance of these trials is to always question ourselves. Is there a better way to do it? And I think that's very critical and very important for our entire agriculture industry. Is whenever we're taking care of these animals, just because it's the way we've done it in the past doesn't mean it's the best way or the most appropriate way going forward. We can always find out better information. But from this trial, I guess to bring that up, what's the importance? The findings were really surprising from this trial. What we found is castration technique is very dependent on environment. We did this trial. The environmental conditions were not ideal. Right. It was very cold. We had a big, nasty cold snap come through. So we had some freezing temperatures. We had some mud. We had, everything that you don't want to see. So what that yielded to is the more invasive the technique, when the environmental conditions are not ideal, essentially they don't gain quite as well.
AJ, how is performance measured in this particular study?
Yeah, so performance, and I guess I should back up and talk a little bit about what we measured. We kind of went all encompassing. We wanted to measure inflammation and healing rates and things like that. So as kind of a a way to look at that, we used a thermography image cameras. So it basically measures heat coming from a surgical site. So it yielded some pretty cool information. We did have some SCR tags, so we got to see movement, behavior. We had a little bit of that information. But then we had weights. So we knew what so we had feed intake, and we also had weekly weights. So we could see how those animals, because of the different castration techniques, the performance hindrance may happen at different times, not always just up front. Healing takes varying different times. So we wanted to look at this over time. So the trial was about 56 days actually. So we wanted to be able to measure that over time on, okay, what was our weekly performances? And then put all that stuff together for the full trial during the receiving period. So yes, we had individual animal weights. We had pen intakes from all the different treatment groups. So all in all, it was a pretty interesting trial.
Did researchers also monitor rumination?
So we did. Part of the SCR tags, it measures chewing, right? And at the time, we still had access to those tags. We did get something that was interesting that it took us a bit to better understand that one of the treatment groups was actually the Burdizo, the crushing technique. We had almost immediate increased rumination rates to like an extreme level that didn't make sense. Like it's not physically possible. And then after looking at the animals, after we started getting a little bit of this data back, went out and actually assessed those animals, they were grinding their teeth. So it was actually more of a painful condition where we some of the more extreme cases we brought in, we treated and gave some anti-inflammatories. But it was from it was a behavior we weren't necessarily expecting from that Burdizo, but where they were grinding their teeth a little bit just from some of the discomfort. So even though it was a non-surgical procedure, it can still be perceived as some pain and inflammation. So it was a good reminder for producers, whether it's in research, whether it's out in the field, work with your veterinarian. Have a plan in place for pain control. We have a lot better tools today than what we've had in the past to be able to alleviate some of those painful scenarios, to be able to get maximum outcomes, gain, heal quickly, all of those things to get those animals back into a comfort level. And especially for these larger size animals, have that conversation with your veterinarian. We have products and things that can help with that. And just from this trial, it brought up that, hey, why are they ruminating more? Well, they weren't. They were grinding their teeth, and that was an artifact. But we were able to pick that up using technology and then be able to, interfere with some of those painful issues to be able to alleviate that for those animals.
That was K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff on the findings of a study on how different castration methods affect cattle when entering a feedlot. If you'd like to learn more about this publication titled Comparing the Performance of Cattle Castrated Using Different Techniques Upon Arrival at the Feedlot, it will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net and is also available at ksubeef.org. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but we'll be back with more up ahead.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Since this spring, dairy producers have been dealing with the impact of HPAI or bird flu in dairy animals. While it hasn't been a widespread problem in Kansas, the big question has been, how is the virus being transmitted within the herd? In research being conducted at Kansas State University, as well as in Germany, the small number of animals being studied have shown that the virus is typically spread through the teat canal. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk looks at the findings of the studies that have been conducted so far and what it may mean for dairy producers moving forward.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some new news on HPAI in dairy animals. As most of you know, we've been dealing with bird flu or HPAI in our industry since this spring. And here in Kansas, we've been very fortunate. At this point, we've only seen 4 of our herds across the state test positive for HPAI, and the last positive was actually April 17th of 2024. And last week, our Kansas Health Department has been working with the USDA and others to try to remove Kansas as a positive state, and it has been long enough now since our last positive that we've actually been removed from positive status as a state. So that's a very positive thing. Some other things that we're starting to learn is from the research that is being done at Kansas State University as well as in Germany. Some of the studies that have been completed, again, these are studies that involve small number of animals, so additional data is going to need to be collected. But I thought I'd let you know some of the things that they've seen from these small studies at this point. Number one, it does appear that the spread of the virus is typically through the teat canal. Research at Kansas State University looked at infecting the udders of cows with the virus, and those animals developed the disease. Research in Germany also looked at different methods of infection. They did infect some udders of cows as well, and those animals did develop HPAI and the typical symptoms that we see. They also infected some other animals with the virus through the mouth and the nose, finding that those animals did develop some symptoms. In other words, they had a mild fever, and they also shed the virus for about 8 days. However, these were all non-lactating animals. They did place some lactating animals in the same pen with the animals after they had been infected with the virus. And over a short period of time, those 3 animals that were lactating that were placed in those pens did not develop the disease. So it may not be that the disease is actually transmitted animal to animal through the air or through the respiratory system. So as we look forward to additional research data that's going to come out in terms of how this virus spreads, it appears at this point that the major way it's spread is actually in the milking system. So we may have to consider some different things as we consider milking cows, backflushing systems in between cows with the sanitizing solution may be one practice that we have to initiate to help stop the spread of this virus animal to animal within our dairy farms. Again, these are results from very small studies, and additional studies are underway that will provide us additional information. It is important that we understand more about how this virus spreads from animal to animal so that we can more effectively control it in the future. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And if you have questions regarding HPAI in dairy animals, contact the Kansas Department of Agriculture or talk with your local veterinarian. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.